I think I might hold the world record for the most expensive piece of mail ever delivered to a residential address. Picture this. You're sitting at your kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, coffee getting cold, when you open what looks like routine HOA correspondence and discover they want $42,000. Not $420, not $4,200, $42,000. Emergency assessment, due in 30 days. No payment plan options. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, because this story gets absolutely wild, and I need to know if this kind of HOA corruption happens in your neighborhood too. The notice was printed on official letterhead, signed by Karen Whitmore, HOA president, with all the legal jargon you'd expect from people who think they run their own little kingdom. Emergency repairs to retaining walls and drainage systems throughout Meadowbrook Estates. Critical structural damage requiring immediate contractor intervention. Failure to pay would result in liens against property and potential foreclosure proceedings. You know, the usual suburban terrorism tactics. Here's what they didn't know about me. When they decided to shake down the quiet guy who lives up the hill, I'm a forensic accountant. I spend my days untangling corporate fraud schemes, following money trails through offshore accounts, and sitting in federal courtrooms watching executives get dragged away in handcuffs. I've seen every financial scam imaginable, from simple embezzlement to multi-million-dollar money laundering operations that would make your head spin. So when I was staring at this assessment notice, my professional instincts were screaming. The numbers didn't add up. The timeline made no sense. The contractor quotes were suspiciously round figures, with no detailed breakdowns. And most telling of all, there was no documentation of any emergency board meetings where this catastrophic damage would have been discussed and voted upon. I walked outside to examine these supposedly catastrophic retaining walls that threatened the very foundation of our community. You want to know what I found? Hairline cracks that look like normal settling. Some minor erosion that could be fixed with a weekend trip to Home Depot, and maybe $300 in materials. Nothing even remotely close to requiring emergency intervention, let alone $42,000 per household. That's when I realized what was really happening here. This wasn't about emergency repairs. This was about something much more sinister. Karen Whitmore and her little HOA board weren't trying to fix our community infrastructure. They were funding something else entirely, and they figured the residents were too trusting or too intimidated to ask questions. They picked the wrong guy to mess with. I've spent 15 years following money trails and exposing financial fraud. I knew exactly how to take apart their little scheme, piece by piece, transaction by transaction. What they thought would be easy money was about to become the biggest mistake of their lives. The investigation was about to begin, and I had a feeling Karen Whitmore had no idea what was coming for her. Let me introduce you to the cast of characters in this suburban crime drama, because understanding who these people are makes what happens next even more satisfying. At the center of it all sat Karen Whitmore, a woman who somehow convinced an entire neighborhood that managing a homeowners association required the same level of authority as running a small country. She had that particular brand of suburban entitlement that comes with driving a white BMW SUV and believing that being HOA president made her basically a federal judge. Karen had been running this show for 6 years, ever since she moved into the biggest house in Meadowbrook Estates and decided the rest of us needed her guidance on proper mailbox colors and acceptable lawn maintenance schedules. She had this way of talking that made everything sound like she was doing you a personal favor just by acknowledging your existence. You know the type. The woman who asks to speak to managers at restaurants because her water glass took 30 seconds too long to get refilled. Her inner circle consisted of Janet Morrison, the treasurer who nodded along to everything Karen said like a bobblehead doll, and Rick Stevens, the vice president whose main qualification seemed to be owning a pickup truck and agreeing with whatever Karen wanted to do. These three had been rubber stamping each other's decisions for years, while the rest of the board rotated through residents who got tired of the drama and quit after a few months. The emergency repair situation they were pushing read like something out of a disaster movie script. According to their official notice, our community was facing imminent catastrophic failure of multiple retaining walls along Willow Creek, which runs behind about 30 houses in the development. They claimed recent heavy rains had caused severe erosion that threatened not just property damage, but potential loss of life if these walls collapse during the next major storm. The drainage system was supposedly on the verge of complete failure, with underground pipes cracked beyond repair and surface drains backing up to create flooding hazards throughout the community. They had engineering reports, contractor estimates, and timeline projections that painted a picture of our neighborhood turning into a muddy wasteland if we didn't act immediately. Here's what struck me as I read through their documentation. Every single contractor quote came from companies I'd never heard of, despite living here for 8 years and knowing most of the local businesses. The engineering reports were suspiciously vague, full of general statements about potential risks without specific measurements or detailed assessments. And most interesting of all, the timeline for this emergency assessment coincided perfectly with the end of summer, right when families are dealing with back-to-school expenses and least likely to have $42,000 lying around to question the details. My forensic accounting training taught me that when someone needs money fast and creates artificial urgency around getting it, you're usually looking at desperation, not a legitimate emergency. Karen Whitmore was desperate for something, and I was starting to suspect it had nothing to do with retaining walls. You might wonder how a neighborhood homeowners association gets enough power to demand $42,000 from each household without anyone batting an eye. Let me tell you, it didn't happen overnight. This was a slow-motion takeover that took years to perfect, and Karen Whitmore orchestrated it like a master chess player moving pieces into position. When Meadowbrook Estates was first built 12 years ago, the HOA was supposed to be a simple maintenance organization: mow the common areas, maintain the entrance landscaping, maybe organize a community garage sale once a year. Monthly dues were $68, and nobody paid much attention to what happened at board meetings because honestly, how much drama can you create over lawn mowing schedules? But Karen saw an opportunity that the rest of us missed. She started small, proposing minor aesthetic improvements that sounded reasonable. $100 special assessment to upgrade the entrance sign. $200 per household to install decorative lighting along the main road. $300 to resurface the community mailbox area. Each time, residents grumbled but paid up because fighting over a few $100s seemed like more trouble than it was worth. What we didn't realize was that Karen was establishing precedent. Every unchallenged assessment became legal ammunition for the next one. She got the bylaws amended to give the board emergency powers during what they deemed crisis situations. She pushed through changes that allowed assessments to be approved by a simple board majority instead of requiring homeowner votes. Slowly but methodically, she transformed our sleepy little HOA into her personal financial empire. The assessments kept getting bigger. $1,000 for emergency tree removal after a storm, $1,500 for upgraded security cameras that nobody remembers asking for, $3,000 for legal fees to fight some mysterious lawsuit that was never fully explained. By the time people realized what was happening, Karen had legal authority to make financial demands that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. And then there was me, living up on Hillcrest Drive in the house that backs up to the woods, the guy nobody really knows or thinks about. I've been here 8 years, but I work long hours downtown and travel frequently for cases. I don't attend community barbecues or join the neighborhood book club. I pay my dues on time, keep my lawn neat, and mind my own business. To Karen and her crew, I was basically invisible. Just another compliant resident who writes checks without asking questions. What they didn't know was that being invisible gave me the perfect vantage point to watch their operation. While they were focused on managing the residents who complained loudly at meetings, they completely overlooked the quiet guy who was trained to spot financial irregularities from a mile away. I'd been watching their pattern of escalating assessments and wondering when someone would finally ask the obvious question, where is all this money actually going? Turns out, I was about to become that someone. When you've spent 15 years investigating financial fraud, you develop a sixth sense for paperwork that's trying too hard to look legitimate. The assessment documentation Karen's board provided was like a masterclass in amateur hour accounting fraud, so obviously problematic that I almost felt insulted they thought it would fool anyone with basic math skills. Let me walk you through what jumped out at me immediately. The contractor quotes were all suspiciously round numbers, exactly $45,000 for retaining wall repairs. Precisely $68,000 for drainage system overhaul, cleanly $32,000 for emergency erosion control. In my experience, legitimate construction estimates look more like $44,738, not these conveniently even figures that screamed fabrication. Even more telling was the timing pressure they were creating. According to their documentation, this catastrophic infrastructure failure had been identified just 3 weeks ago, required immediate action to prevent imminent disaster. But somehow, they'd managed to get detailed engineering assessments and multiple contractor bids in record time. Anyone who's ever hired a contractor knows you can't get 3 companies to show up and provide detailed quotes for major construction work in under a month, let alone during peak summer construction season. The engineering report raised even more red flags. It was signed by someone calling himself a professional engineer, but when I looked up his credentials, the state licensing board had no record of anyone by that name holding a valid PE license. The report itself was full of generic language about potential risks and recommended preventive measures, but contained no actual measurements, soil analysis results, or specific technical specifications that would justify the enormous expense. But here's where it got really interesting. I decided to reach out to Karen directly with some basic questions about the documentation, thinking maybe there was additional information that would clear up my concerns. I sent a polite email asking for copies of the original engineering assessments, proof of contractor licensing and insurance, and a breakdown of how the per-household assessment amounts were calculated. Her response was a thing of beauty. And by beauty, I mean a perfect example of how guilty people react when someone asks reasonable questions. Instead of providing the requested documentation, I got a condescending lecture about how the board had already done their due diligence and didn't need to justify their decisions to residents who lacked the expertise to understand complex infrastructure issues. She actually wrote, and I quote, "I find it concerning that certain residents feel entitled to micromanage board decisions when they clearly lack the professional qualifications to evaluate technical engineering matters." She suggested I trust the expertise of board members who had been responsibly managing community affairs for years, and reminded me that the 30-day payment deadline was non-negotiable, regardless of my personal concerns about the documentation. That response told me everything I needed to know. Legitimate contractors and engineers welcome scrutiny of their work. Honest board members provide transparency when residents ask reasonable questions. Karen's defensive, dismissive attitude wasn't just arrogant. It was exactly how people act when they're hiding something they can't afford to have discovered. Let me tell you what it's like when 15 years of investigating corporate fraud cases suddenly focuses on your own neighborhood. It's like putting on prescription glasses for the first time and realizing the world has always been sharp and clear. You just couldn't see it properly before. Karen's assessment scam wasn't sophisticated financial engineering. It was amateur hour compared to the schemes I deal with professionally. My day job involves unraveling complex financial fraud cases for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and law firms handling white-collar criminal defense. Just last month, I testified in federal court about a healthcare billing scheme where executives were diverting Medicare reimbursements through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The defendants thought they were clever, routing millions through 12 different entities across 4 countries. It took me 6 weeks to map their entire operation and present it in a way that made the jury understand exactly how they stole taxpayer money. Before that, I spent 8 months investigating a construction company that was inflating government contract costs by creating fake subcontractors and billing for work that was never performed. Sound familiar? The pattern recognition kicked in immediately when I saw Karen's documentation. Inflated quotes from questionable contractors, artificial urgency to prevent detailed scrutiny, and defensive responses when asked for basic verification. It's the same playbook, just scaled down from corporate boardrooms to suburban HOA meetings. The difference between investigating corporate fraud and neighborhood fraud isn't the complexity of the schemes. It's the arrogance of the perpetrators. Corporate executives know they're breaking federal laws and usually make some effort to cover their tracks. They hire lawyers, create elaborate paper trails, and understand they're risking prison time if they get caught. Karen Whitmore was operating like she was above scrutiny, making basic mistakes that would get laughed out of any serious financial crimes court. What really triggered my professional instincts was the pattern of escalation I'd seen in her previous assessments. It's exactly what we call the testing phase in fraud investigations. Criminals start small to see if anyone's paying attention, then gradually increase the scope of their operations once they feel confident they won't get caught. Karen had been testing Meadowbrook Estates residents for years, and we'd failed every single test by paying whatever she demanded without asking questions. The $42,000 assessment wasn't an emergency repair fund. It was graduation day. She'd built up to this moment through years of smaller thefts, establishing legal precedent and resident compliance patterns that would make this massive grab seem like just another routine HOA expense. From a forensic accounting perspective, it was actually impressive how systematically she'd conditioned the community to accept financial demands without documentation. But here's what Karen didn't understand about forensic accountants. We don't just identify fraud, we build bulletproof cases that hold up under legal scrutiny. Every transaction leaves a trail, every lie creates inconsistencies, and every cover-up attempt generates more evidence. Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her criminal career by targeting someone who makes a living exposing exactly this kind of scheme. Saturday morning at 6:30, I grabbed my camera, measuring tape, and a thermos of coffee for what I like to call a field audit. In corporate fraud cases, there's always a moment when you have to leave the comfort of spreadsheets and document analysis to go see what's actually happening on the ground. Sometimes the numbers lie, but concrete and steel don't. I started at the northern section of Willow Creek, where Karen's engineering report claimed the most severe retaining wall damage threatened 3 houses with immediate foundation collapse. What I found was a 4-foot concrete barrier with some hairline cracks that looked like normal settling you'd see in any structure that's been in the ground for over a decade. I'm talking about surface cracks maybe 2 millimeters wide and 6 inches long. The kind of minor cosmetic issues that might need attention in 5 or 10 years, but definitely not the catastrophic structural failure requiring emergency intervention. I took 47 photographs from different angles, measuring each crack with a digital caliper I brought from my office. The largest crack measured 3.2 millimeters at its widest point and extended exactly 14 inches along the surface. For reference, structural engineers don't even recommend repair action on concrete cracks under 5 millimeters unless they're actively growing or showing signs of water infiltration. These cracks were stable, dry, and completely non-threatening. Moving downstream, I examined what the report described as critical erosion zones, where soil washout was undermining retaining wall foundations. You want to know what I found? Some minor surface erosion where rainwater had carved small channels in the dirt, maybe 3 inches deep at most. The kind of erosion you could fix with a couple bags of topsoil and some grass seed from any garden center. Total cost to address the actual problem. Maybe $200 in materials and an afternoon of work. The drainage system inspection was even more revealing. Karen's documentation claimed underground pipes were cracked beyond repair and causing dangerous flooding conditions throughout the community. I spent 2 hours walking every storm drain, checking water flow patterns, and looking for signs of backup or overflow. The system was working perfectly. Water flowed freely through all surface drains, and there were no signs of standing water, overflow damage, or infrastructure failure anywhere in the community. Here's what really sealed it for me. I found the original construction permits from when Meadowbrook Estates was built 12 years ago. The retaining walls and drainage systems were designed and built to exceed county requirements for 50-year storm events. We'd need massive environmental changes or catastrophic ground shifting to create the kind of emergency Karen was claiming, and there had been no unusual weather events, earthquakes, or construction activity that could explain sudden infrastructure failure. I was looking at a perfectly functional storm management system that would serve our community for decades without major intervention. Karen wasn't trying to fix emergency damage. She was manufacturing a crisis to justify stealing over $500,000 from her neighbors. Now I had photographic evidence, precise measurements, and documented proof that her entire emergency assessment was built on lies. In forensic accounting, we have a saying, documents don't lie, but people who create documents often do. The trick is knowing which papers to ask for and how to ask for them in ways that can't be legally ignored. Luckily for me, HOA boards are required by state law to maintain detailed financial records and make them available to homeowners upon written request. Karen was about to learn that stonewalling a forensic accountant is like trying to stop a freight train with a paper bag. I drafted my first formal records request on Monday morning, using the exact language from state HOA statutes to ensure she couldn't claim my request was invalid or unreasonable. I wanted 3 years of complete financial statements, including bank records, check registers, and credit card statements for all HOA accounts. I requested copies of all board meeting minutes from the past 2 years, plus any emergency or executive session minutes that weren't included in regular monthly meetings. Most importantly, I demanded copies of all contracts, proposals, and correspondence with the engineering firm and contractors involved in the current assessment. The key to effective records requests is making them legally bulletproof while demonstrating you know exactly what you're looking for. I included specific statutory citations, set a reasonable timeline of 15 business days for compliance, and sent everything via certified mail with return receipt requested. Karen couldn't claim she didn't receive it, couldn't argue the request was legally invalid, and couldn't pretend she didn't understand what I was asking for. Her response came back in exactly 3 days, which told me she was panicking. Instead of providing the requested documents, I got a 2-page letter from what she claimed was the HOA's attorney, stating that my request was overly broad, potentially harassing, and designed to interfere with legitimate board business. The letter suggested I limit my request to summary financial information that was already available in annual reports, and warned that excessive records requests could result in legal action against me for disrupting HOA operations. Here's the beautiful thing about that response. It was legally meaningless and practically incriminating. State law doesn't allow HOA boards to refuse records requests because they consider them inconvenient or overly broad. Homeowners have absolute rights to inspect financial records, and threatening legal action against residents for exercising those rights is actually grounds for removing board members. Karen's lawyer either didn't understand HOA law or wasn't actually a lawyer at all. I sent back a second request the same day, this time copying the state HOA regulatory agency and referencing the specific penalties for unlawful denial of records access. I also requested copies of the retainer agreement and correspondence with this mysterious attorney, since legal expenses over $500 require board approval and homeowner notification under our bylaws. Karen's response to the second request was even better. She called me directly, and I've got to quote this because it perfectly captures her entitled mindset. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this board has been managing community affairs just fine without input from residents who clearly don't understand how these things work." That phone call convinced me I was dealing with someone who genuinely believed she was above accountability to the people whose money she was stealing. Sometimes the most damning evidence in a fraud case isn't what you find, it's what's mysteriously missing. After 2 weeks of legal pressure, Karen finally provided some of the requested documents, but what she gave me was like receiving a puzzle with half the pieces deliberately removed. The gaps in documentation were so obvious and systematic that they practically screamed guilty conscience. The meeting minutes were a masterpiece of selective editing. I had records for regular monthly board meetings, but there were suspicious gaps during periods when major financial decisions should have been discussed and voted on. For example, the $1,500 security camera assessment from 18 months ago appeared in the financial records as an approved expense, but there were no meeting minutes from the 2 months when that decision would have been made, just convenient blanks in the official record. Even more telling were the executive session minutes, which Karen claimed didn't exist because the board rarely held closed meetings. But the financial records showed legal expenses and consultant fees that could only have been approved in executive sessions, since they weren't mentioned in any regular meeting minutes. Either Karen was lying about the executive sessions, or the board was approving major expenses without proper documentation. Both scenarios pointed to deliberate concealment of financial decision-making. The contractor agreements were even more problematic. What Karen provided weren't actually signed contracts. They were unsigned proposals and estimate letters that looked like they'd been created specifically to justify the assessment amounts. Real construction contracts include detailed specifications, timeline requirements, warranty provisions, and liability insurance documentation. These documents had none of that. They were basically fancy invoices designed to look official without containing any legally binding commitments. But here's where it got really interesting. I started cross-referencing the vendor names against state business licensing databases and discovered that 2 of the 3 companies providing quotes didn't exist as registered business entities. No business licenses, no contractor certifications, no insurance policies, and no track record of previous work in our county. They were ghost companies, created specifically to generate fraudulent documentation for this assessment. The 3rd company did exist, but when I researched their background, I found something that made my blood run cold. The business address listed on their estimate was the same as Janet Morrison's home address, the HOA treasurer who rubber-stamped all of Karen's financial decisions. The company had been incorporated just 6 months ago, with Janet listed as the registered agent, right around the time Karen would have been planning this massive assessment scheme. This wasn't just inflated repair costs or typical HOA corruption. This was an elaborate conspiracy involving fake companies, manufactured documentation, and systematic destruction of meeting records. Karen hadn't just decided to steal $42,000 from each household. She'd created an entire fraudulent infrastructure to make the theft look legitimate while covering her tracks. I was looking at a criminal enterprise operating under the cover of Suburban Homeowner Association business, and I was probably the only person in Meadowbrook Estates with the professional skills to expose the full scope of their operation. In 15 years of forensic accounting, I've learned that criminals always get greedy, and greed always leaves a paper trail. What I discovered buried in the HOA's credit card statements wasn't just evidence of theft. It was a masterclass in how entitled people rationalize stealing from their neighbors while living like royalty on someone else's dime. The smoking gun came disguised as legitimate board expenses in the financial records Karen had reluctantly provided. Mixed in with routine payments for landscaping and maintenance were credit card charges that made my jaw drop. $4,000 at the Grand Wailea Resort in Maui during what the meeting minutes described as a strategic planning retreat. $3,000 at Napa Valley restaurants and wineries during a weekend board workshop on community development initiatives. $2,800 at a luxury spa resort in Scottsdale for what was documented as emergency board meetings to address crisis management protocols. Here's the beautiful thing about credit card fraud. Every transaction includes timestamps, merchant details, and often specific itemized charges that tell the complete story. That $4,000 Maui retreat? The credit card statement showed charges for premium ocean view suites, poolside cabana rentals, and multiple expensive dinners for people who were supposedly conducting urgent HOA business. The timestamps revealed they were at the resort spa, getting massages during the exact hours when emergency board meetings were scheduled to be held. But what really sealed their fate was the pattern I discovered when I cross-referenced these luxury expenses with contractor payments. Every single vacation charged to HOA accounts coincided with major assessment collections or large contractor payments flowing through the association's bank accounts. It wasn't random theft. It was systematic reward spending after successful financial operations. The Napa Valley weekend happened 3 days after residents paid the $3,000 emergency tree removal assessment. The Scottsdale Spa retreat was booked immediately after the $1,500 security camera payment cleared. Karen had turned HOA theft into a performance bonus system, celebrating each successful extraction of money from homeowners with increasingly lavish personal vacations funded by the same accounts. Even better, the resort bookings were made using Karen's personal information, but paid for with HOA credit cards, creating an undeniable connection between her identity and the fraudulent charges. The receipts showed room service meals for her entire family, including her teenage children who definitely weren't participating in any legitimate board business. She'd been treating our community association like her personal vacation fund for over 2 years. The most damning evidence was a resort spa charge from last month that was categorized in the financial records as engineering consultation fees. Karen had literally charged a couple's massage and facial treatment to the same budget line item she was using to justify the $42,000 emergency assessment. She wasn't just stealing money. She was actively spending it on luxury treatments while telling homeowners we faced a financial crisis requiring immediate emergency payments. This wasn't embezzlement anymore. This was organized theft with a level of arrogance that suggested Karen truly believed she deserved to live like a queen on her neighbor's money. She was about to learn exactly how expensive that belief would become. Building a fraud case that will hold up in court requires more than just smoking gun evidence. It demands creating an ironclad documentation system that tells the complete story from beginning to end. I spent the next 2 weeks doing what I do best, transforming scattered financial irregularities into a comprehensive criminal case file that would make federal prosecutors smile. The first step was creating what we call a master timeline spreadsheet that cross-referenced every suspicious transaction with corresponding board activities, assessment collections, and documented expenses. I mapped out 37 separate incidents over a 2-year period where HOA funds were diverted for personal use, ranging from small restaurant charges disguised as meeting expenses to major resort bookings categorized as professional development costs. Each entry in my spreadsheet included the transaction date, amount, vendor information, stated business purpose, and actual evidence of what the expense really funded. For the Maui resort charges, I had credit card statements showing premium suite bookings, spa treatments, and fine dining expenses, contrasted with meeting minutes, claiming the board was conducting emergency budget discussions during those exact dates. The timeline made it impossible to argue these were legitimate business expenses. But the real beauty of forensic accounting is establishing patterns that demonstrate intent rather than accidental mismanagement. Karen's theft followed a predictable cycle. Major assessment announcements, followed by aggressive collection efforts, followed immediately by personal luxury spending that corresponded directly to the amounts collected. She wasn't randomly skimming money. She was operating a systematic extraction and reward system. I created detailed financial reconciliation reports that tracked every dollar flowing through HOA accounts, comparing stated expenses against actual expenditures, and identifying the gaps where money disappeared into personal use. The numbers were staggering. Over 24 months, Karen and her inner circle had diverted over $87,000 in homeowner funds for personal vacations, restaurant meals, and luxury purchases that had nothing to do with community management. The contrast between my professional documentation and their amateur hour cover-up attempts was almost comical. Karen's financial records were a mess of inconsistent categorizations, missing receipts, and obvious alterations to expense descriptions. She literally used correction fluid to change vendor names on credit card statements, apparently not understanding that the original merchant information was still visible in the bank's electronic records. My favorite example of their incompetence was finding 3 different explanations for the same $4,000 Maui resort charge in 3 different board documents. First, it was emergency meeting expenses, then strategic planning costs, then professional development training. Karen couldn't keep her lies straight because she'd never expected anyone to actually examine the details of her theft operation. By the time I finished documenting everything, I had a 43-page case file with supporting exhibits that read like a federal indictment. Every transaction was verified, every pattern was established, and every attempt at concealment was exposed with photographic evidence and bank records. Karen had created the perfect paper trail of her own criminal activity, and I just organized it into a prosecution-ready package that would destroy her life and send her to prison. Taking on a criminal conspiracy by yourself is like trying to stop a freight train with your bare hands. Even with bulletproof evidence and professional expertise, I needed allies who were willing to stand up against Karen's intimidation tactics and support what was about to become a very public battle. The problem with neighborhood politics is that most people just want to keep their heads down and avoid confrontation, even when they're being systematically robbed. My first approach was strategic. Identify the homeowners who had been most vocal about previous assessments and who had the financial resources to weather potential retaliation. I started with David and Susan Chen, who lived on Maple Street and had openly questioned the security camera assessment at last year's annual meeting. When I showed them the evidence of luxury vacation charges disguised as board expenses, Susan literally dropped her coffee cup. David stared at the credit card statements for a full minute before saying, "I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined it was this brazen." The Chens agreed to support whatever legal action was necessary, but they wanted more neighbors involved before going public. That led me to the Hendersons, a young couple with twin toddlers who were struggling to come up with $42,000 for what they'd been told was emergency infrastructure repair. When I showed them photographs of the perfectly functional retaining walls contrasted with receipts for Karen's spa treatments, Jennifer Henderson started crying, not from sadness, but from pure rage at being manipulated while trying to manage their family budget. But the most important ally I found was someone I'd barely noticed before, Mr. Harold Peterson, a retired attorney who lived quietly on Elm Street and rarely attended community meetings. I'd seen him walking his ancient golden retriever every morning, but never realized he'd spent 40 years practicing corporate law before retiring to our neighborhood 5 years ago. When I approached him with my documentation, his reaction was immediate and decisive. "This isn't just theft," Peterson said after reviewing my case file. "This is mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The federal government has jurisdiction because they used postal services to deliver fraudulent assessment notices and electronic banking to transfer stolen funds. He explained that Karen's operation met the legal definition of racketeering, which carried much more serious penalties than simple embezzlement. Peterson offered to provide legal guidance and help coordinate our response, but he made one thing crystal clear: we needed to involve law enforcement immediately, rather than trying to handle this through internal HOA channels. "Karen has committed federal crimes," he said. "This isn't a community dispute anymore. It's a criminal case that belongs in federal court." With Peterson's legal expertise backing my financial evidence and 3 other households committed to supporting prosecution, I finally had enough firepower to take on Karen's criminal empire. The quiet guy up the hill had assembled a team that was about to bring down the most corrupt HOA board in suburban history. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in the community center, and I walked in carrying a folder that was about to destroy Karen Whitmore's entire world. She'd called this meeting to address what she termed disruptive resident behavior and to finalize the $42,000 assessment timeline. What she didn't know was that she was about to face the most devastating cross-examination of her life. The room was packed with about 30 homeowners, which was unusual since most meetings attracted maybe 8 people who had nothing better to do. Karen sat at the front table with Janet Morrison and Rick Stevens, looking confident and completely in control. She opened with her standard speech about board authority and the importance of trusting elected representatives to make difficult financial decisions for the community's benefit. Then she made the mistake of asking if anyone had questions about the assessment documentation. I stood up, introduced myself as a resident forensic accountant, and began what would become legendary in neighborhood history as the most brutal public takedown ever delivered at a suburban HOA meeting. "Karen, I've reviewed the financial records you provided, and I have some concerns about the accuracy of your emergency repair claims." I kept my voice calm and professional, like I was testifying in federal court. "Can you explain why the engineering report is signed by someone who doesn't hold a valid professional engineering license in the state?" Her response was immediate and telling. Instead of addressing the question, she went straight to personal attack mode. "I find it inappropriate for residents to question technical assessments they're not qualified to evaluate. This board has been responsibly managing community affairs, and we don't need to justify every decision to people who lack relevant expertise." That's when I opened my folder and pulled out the credit card statements. "Can you explain why HOA funds were used to pay for a $4,000 vacation at the Grand Wailea Resort in Maui that coincided with dates when emergency board meetings were supposedly being held here in our community center?" The silence in that room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Karen's face went through about 6 different colors before settling on a shade of red I'd never seen on a human being before. Janet Morrison actually gasped out loud when she realized what was happening. But Karen's response was pure gold, and I'll never forget her exact words. "I don't appreciate ungrateful residents who don't understand the personal sacrifices board members make to serve this community. The board occasionally requires retreats and professional development opportunities that are entirely appropriate uses of community funds." That quote sealed her fate. She'd just admitted to using homeowner money for personal vacations while calling residents ungrateful for questioning obvious theft. The room erupted with angry voices demanding explanations, and Karen lost complete control of the meeting she'd called to intimidate anyone who dared question her authority. The confrontation was over, but the real fireworks were just beginning. The morning after that explosive board meeting, I walked into my home office at 6 a.m. and began what I like to call the nuclear option in fraud cases. When you've got ironclad evidence of federal crimes, and the perpetrators are still trying to brazen their way through obvious lies, it's time to bring in the big guns. Karen Whitmore was about to learn that there's a massive difference between intimidating homeowners at community meetings and facing federal law enforcement agencies. My first call went to the State HOA Regulatory Commission, where I filed a formal complaint alleging financial mismanagement, violation of fiduciary duties, and fraudulent assessment practices. I submitted my complete case file with 43 pages of documented evidence, including the credit card statements showing luxury vacation charges and the timeline proving systematic theft. The investigator who took my call said they'd never seen documentation this comprehensive from a homeowner complaint. Next was the district attorney's office, where I requested a meeting with the White-Collar Crimes Division to discuss potential prosecution for mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges. I hand-delivered a complete forensic analysis that would have cost any corporation $50,000 if they'd hired my firm to produce it. The prosecutor who reviewed my documentation called it the most thorough fraud case file he'd seen from a private citizen. But the real nuclear weapon was my call to the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. Karen's scheme involved using postal services to deliver fraudulent assessment notices and electronic banking to transfer stolen funds across state lines, which gave federal agencies jurisdiction over her entire operation. The special agent assigned to review my case said they typically spend months developing the kind of evidence I'd already organized into prosecution-ready format. While I was methodically destroying Karen's life through official channels, she was entering full panic mode and making every mistake you'd expect from an amateur criminal who suddenly realizes the walls are closing in. She started calling homeowners individually, trying to convince them that my evidence was fabricated and that I was some kind of disgruntled resident with a personal vendetta against the board. Her damage control efforts were pathetic and legally disastrous. She sent emails to the entire community claiming that my forensic accounting credentials were fake and that I was spreading malicious lies to avoid paying my fair share of legitimate community expenses. What she didn't realize was that written defamation of someone's professional reputation while under investigation for criminal activity is exactly the kind of behavior that prosecutors love to see from defendants who are digging their own graves. The contrast between our approaches was perfect. I was filing detailed complaints with multiple law enforcement agencies while maintaining complete professional composure and letting the evidence speak for itself. Karen was sending panicked emails full of personal attacks and obvious lies that created additional evidence of her guilt. Every desperate move she made just handed prosecutors more ammunition for her eventual federal indictment. Karen Whitmore was about to discover that when you commit federal crimes against a forensic accountant, the justice system responds very quickly and very decisively. Nothing exposes criminal guilt quite like watching someone frantically try to rewrite history while law enforcement agencies are already building their case. The week after my complaints hit multiple government agencies, Karen and her board went into full cover-up mode, making every possible mistake that guilty people make when they realize they're about to face serious consequences. The first sign of panic came in the form of suddenly revised financial statements that magically appeared in everyone's mailboxes 3 days after the FBI opened their investigation. Karen had apparently spent the entire weekend with Janet Morrison trying to retroactively categorize luxury vacation expenses as legitimate business costs. The Maui resort charges were now described as emergency board retreat expenses for crisis management training. The Napa Valley Wine Country Weekend had been transformed into professional development costs for community leadership certification. What they didn't understand was that changing expense descriptions after federal investigators have already seen the original documentation isn't damage control. It's additional evidence of obstruction of justice and tampering with financial records. Every revision they made just proved they knew the original categorizations were fraudulent, while creating new criminal charges for attempting to conceal evidence during an active investigation. But Karen's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as the pressure mounted. She started showing up at neighbors' houses unannounced, demanding they sign statements saying they supported the board's financial management and believed my allegations were false. When the Hendersons refused to sign her loyalty pledge, she screamed at them in their own driveway about ungrateful residents who didn't deserve quality community leadership. The most desperate move came when Karen tried to call an emergency board meeting to vote on suspending my HOA membership for what she termed disruptive and defamatory behavior toward elected officials. She apparently believed she could somehow make the criminal investigation disappear by kicking me out of the Homeowners Association. Mr. Peterson, our retired attorney ally, had to explain to her via certified letter that HOA boards don't have authority to expel members for reporting crimes to law enforcement agencies. Rick Stevens, the vice president who had rubber-stamped Karen's decisions for years, finally grew a spine and resigned from the board via email, stating he had no knowledge of financial irregularities and wanted to distance himself from any illegal activities. His resignation letter was carefully worded by what was obviously a criminal defense attorney, which told me he'd figured out the seriousness of his legal exposure. Janet Morrison took the opposite approach, doubling down on loyalty to Karen, while simultaneously trying to claim she had no involvement in financial decision-making despite being the treasurer who signed off on every fraudulent expense. Her panic was evident in rambling emails to homeowners, explaining that she just did what Karen told her to do and never questioned the details of board expenditures. Watching Karen's criminal enterprise collapse in real time was like observing a masterclass in how not to respond to federal investigation. Every move she made just provided prosecutors with additional evidence while demonstrating clear consciousness of guilt that would make jury conviction almost automatic. When federal agencies start investigating suburban HOA fraud, word travels fast through local media circles. The call came on a Thursday morning from Jennifer Walsh, an investigative reporter for Channel 7 News, who had apparently received a tip about federal law enforcement interest in homeowner association corruption. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to discuss the case on camera, and I realized this was about to become much bigger than a neighborhood dispute. The timing was perfect from a strategic standpoint. Public attention would put additional pressure on prosecutors to treat this case seriously, while making it impossible for Karen to intimidate witnesses or manipulate the narrative. I agreed to an on-camera interview, but only after consulting with Mr. Peterson about the legal implications of discussing an active investigation. The news segment aired on Friday evening and transformed our quiet suburban scandal into a regional story about HOA corruption and homeowner rights. I appeared calm and professional in my interview, explaining the financial irregularities I'd discovered while emphasizing that I was simply a concerned resident who used my professional skills to protect my neighbors from theft. I spoke in measured tones about the importance of financial transparency and accountability in community organizations, letting the documented evidence speak for itself. Karen's response was a public relations disaster that perfectly captured her entitled mindset and complete lack of awareness about her legal situation. When the reporter approached her for comment, she launched into a defensive rant about ungrateful residents who didn't appreciate the personal sacrifices made by volunteer board members. She actually said on camera that homeowners should trust elected officials to make appropriate financial decisions without micromanaging every expense detail. The contrast was striking. My interview focused on facts, documentation, and the importance of protecting community funds from misuse. Karen's response was pure emotion and deflection, complaining about being persecuted by residents who didn't understand the complexities of community management. She never once addressed the specific allegations of luxury vacation charges or fake contractor schemes, instead attacking my motivations and claiming the investigation was based on personal vendettas. But the moment that made Karen infamous came when the reporter asked her directly about the Maui resort charges. Her response was jaw-dropping. Board members deserve reasonable compensation for the time and effort we invest in serving this community. And if that occasionally includes professional development opportunities at quality facilities, then residents should appreciate our dedication rather than questioning our methods. She just admitted on television that she considered luxury vacations to be reasonable compensation for volunteer HOA service, paid for with money extracted from homeowners through fraudulent emergency assessments. The clip went viral on social media within hours, turning Karen Whitmore into a symbol of suburban entitlement and HOA corruption. The story was picked up by regional news outlets and homeowner advocacy groups, transforming our neighborhood fraud case into a statewide discussion about HOA oversight and accountability. Karen had just made herself the public face of everything people hate about homeowners associations. There's something about public exposure that gives people permission to finally speak up about suspicious behavior they'd been afraid to question, within 48 hours of the news story airing. My phone was ringing constantly with homeowners who'd been quietly harboring doubts about Karen's financial management, but never had the courage or expertise to challenge her authority. The first call came from Maria Santos, who lived on Oak Street and had been keeping meticulous records of every HOA assessment for the past 4 years. She'd noticed patterns that individually seemed insignificant, but together painted a disturbing picture of systematic financial manipulation. Emergency assessments always seemed to coincide with periods when Karen was posting vacation photos on social media, and contractor work schedules never matched the urgency described in official board communications. But the most damaging testimony came from Tom Bradley, a retired construction foreman who'd been quietly documenting the gap between claimed emergency repairs and actual work being performed. He'd taken photographs of every so-called crisis project over the past 2 years, creating an inadvertent archive that proved most emergency repairs were either completely unnecessary or performed by unqualified workers at dramatically inflated costs. Bradley's evidence was devastating because it came from someone with 40 years of construction experience who could credibly evaluate the legitimacy of repair work. His documentation showed that the $1,500 emergency tree removal assessment had involved cutting down 3 healthy trees that posed no safety threat. Performed by a crew that clearly lacked proper licensing and insurance, the work could have been done safely by any reputable tree service for less than $400. Even more damning was his discovery that several emergency repair projects had been invoiced and paid for multiple times using different contractor names but identical work descriptions. Karen had been billing the same fabricated repairs through her network of shell companies, collecting payment from homeowners 2 and 3 times for work that was never actually performed. As more evidence poured in, the remaining board members began their inevitable retreat from Karen's sinking ship. Janet Morrison hired a criminal defense attorney and released a statement claiming she had been manipulated by Karen's superior knowledge of financial management and had no independent involvement in fraudulent schemes. She portrayed herself as a naive volunteer who trusted the HOA president's expertise without understanding the criminal nature of their financial operations. Rick Stevens, despite his earlier resignation, found himself still legally exposed as a board member who had approved fraudulent expenditures during his tenure. His attorney issued a statement emphasizing Rick's limited financial literacy and claiming he had relied entirely on Karen's representations about the legitimacy of various assessments and expenses. The most telling indication of Karen's isolation came when I received a call from her own husband, requesting a confidential meeting to discuss his legal exposure as a spouse who had benefited from stolen homeowner funds. Even her family was distancing themselves as federal investigators closed in on charges that could result in decades of prison time and complete financial ruin. The call I'd been waiting for came on a Monday morning at exactly 9:15 a.m. Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's White Collar Crime Division wanted to schedule a formal interview to discuss my documentation of financial irregularities in the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Her tone was professional but urgent, the kind of voice that tells you federal law enforcement has moved beyond preliminary review into active criminal investigation mode. The district attorney's office had already opened a formal case the previous week, but Agent Torres explained that federal jurisdiction applied because Karen's scheme involved mail fraud through the Postal Service delivery of fraudulent assessment notices, wire fraud through electronic transfer of stolen funds, and potential racketeering charges due to the systematic nature of her criminal enterprise. What had started as a neighborhood dispute was now officially a federal case, with the kind of penalties that destroy lives and send people to prison for decades. Agent Torres requested copies of all my documentation, but she also wanted something more valuable: my professional analysis of the evidence. and my assessment of potential additional crimes that might not be immediately obvious to investigators without forensic accounting expertise. The FBI was essentially asking me to serve as an unpaid consultant on Karen's prosecution, which told me they were building a case designed to result in maximum criminal penalties. The investigation moved with the kind of methodical precision that federal agencies bring to financial crimes cases. Within 2 weeks, I learned that Karen's bank accounts had been frozen pending completion of asset forfeiture proceedings, and that search warrants had been executed at her home, Janet Morrison's residence, and the offices of the fake contracting companies that had been used to generate fraudulent invoices. But the most telling sign that Karen's world was crumbling came when she hired Marcus Webb, one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the state, whose specialty was representing corporate executives facing federal fraud charges. Webb's retainer alone probably cost more than most people's annual salary, which meant Karen was either spending the last of her stolen money on legal defense or had finally realized the serious nature of her legal exposure. The speed of the official response surprised even me, and I'd seen federal agencies move quickly on corporate fraud cases. Typically, investigations of this complexity take months to develop beyond the preliminary inquiry stage. But the combination of my comprehensive documentation and the additional evidence provided by other homeowners had given prosecutors everything they needed to move directly to formal charges. Karen went from confidently dismissing my allegations as a personal vendetta to facing potential federal prison sentences in less than 60 days. The quiet suburban homeowners association president who thought she was above accountability was about to discover exactly how seriously federal law enforcement treats systematic theft from American citizens, regardless of whether it happens in corporate boardrooms or neighborhood community centers. When federal investigators start pulling threads in financial fraud cases, they often discover that what initially appears to be simple theft is actually the visible tip of a much larger criminal iceberg. The phone call from Agent Torres 3 weeks into the investigation contained news that made my jaw drop, and I'd thought I'd already seen the worst of Karen's criminal operation. The FBI's forensic accounting team had discovered that Karen's theft operation was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Using bank records obtained through federal search warrants, they'd traced a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that had been systematically draining HOA funds for over 4 years. The $42,000 emergency assessment wasn't the crime. It was just the final desperate grab before the entire scheme collapsed under its own weight. Karen had created 7 different fake contracting companies with business addresses in 3 states, all designed to generate fraudulent invoices for work that was never performed. Each company had its own bank account, business registration, and carefully crafted paper trail designed to make the billing appear legitimate. Money would flow from HOA accounts to these fake companies, then get transferred through a series of intermediate accounts before ending up in offshore banking facilities in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. But the most damning discovery was a kickback scheme involving legitimate contractors who were willing to inflate their invoices in exchange for a percentage of the excess billing. Karen had convinced several local businesses to submit inflated quotes for routine maintenance work, with the understanding that they would perform the actual work at fair market rates and kick back the difference to accounts she controlled. This wasn't just theft, it was corruption of the local business community and tax evasion through unreported income. The scope of the money laundering operation was staggering. Over 4 years, Karen had diverted over $320,000 from homeowner funds through her network of shell companies and fraudulent contractors. The luxury vacations I discovered were just pocket change compared to the systematic extraction of community resources she'd been conducting since taking control of the HOA board. Even more shocking was the discovery that Karen had been planning the massive $42,000 assessment for over 18 months, using it as an exit strategy to extract one final enormous payment before disappearing with enough stolen money to live comfortably for years. Federal investigators found detailed planning documents on her personal computer, including research on non-extradition countries and offshore banking procedures for American citizens seeking to hide assets from federal authorities. The evidence showed that Karen had transformed a simple homeowners association into her personal criminal enterprise, using her position of trust to systematically loot community resources while planning an eventual escape from prosecution. What I'd initially identified as inflated repair costs was actually the final phase of a long-term criminal conspiracy that had been robbing our neighbors for years while they trustingly paid whatever assessments the board demanded. At 5:47 a.m. on a crisp October morning, I was standing at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee when I witnessed the most satisfying moment of the entire investigation. A convoy of black federal vehicles rolled silently down Meadowbrook Drive, followed by local police cars and what looked like enough law enforcement personnel to arrest a small army. The quiet suburban neighborhood that Karen had used as her personal criminal empire was about to become the scene of a federal takedown that would make national news. The FBI doesn't mess around when executing arrest warrants for financial crimes. I watched through my window as agents in tactical gear surrounded Karen's house, while others positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the neighborhood. The coordination was military precise, designed to prevent any possibility of evidence destruction or flight attempts. After months of building an airtight case against Karen's criminal operation, federal law enforcement was finally ready to bring down the hammer. Karen's arrest was everything I'd hoped it would be. At exactly 6 a.m., agents knocked on her front door and identified themselves as federal officers with arrest warrants for wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges. When she opened the door in her bathrobe, clearly expecting to find a neighbor or delivery person, the shock on her face was visible from my kitchen window 2 blocks away. The woman who had spent years intimidating homeowners and dismissing concerns about her financial management was suddenly facing federal agents with handcuffs. The perp walk was spectacular. News crews had been tipped off about the arrests and were positioned to capture Karen being led from her house in handcuffs, wearing the kind of orange jumpsuit that makes federal defendants look appropriately humble. The contrast with her previous arrogant dismissal of my allegations was perfect. 3 months earlier, she'd been calling homeowners ungrateful for questioning her authority. Now she was being arrested on federal charges that could send her to prison for decades. But Karen wasn't the only one taken down that morning. Federal agents simultaneously arrested Janet Morrison at her home on Elm Street and Rick Stevens at his office downtown. The coordinated raids were designed to prevent communication between co-conspirators and ensure that no evidence could be destroyed once the arrests began. By 7 a.m., the entire criminal leadership of Meadowbrook Estates HOA was in federal custody. The flashing red and blue lights painting stripes across our neighborhood created an almost festive atmosphere that matched my mood perfectly. After months of methodical investigation and documentation, justice was finally being served with the kind of dramatic federal response that Karen's crimes deserved. The quiet guy up the hill had just watched his forensic accounting work transform into federal arrest warrants that would destroy the lives of everyone who had participated in systematically robbing our community. The footage of Karen's arrest made national news within hours, turning our suburban HOA corruption case into a symbol of federal law enforcement's commitment to prosecuting financial crimes, regardless of their scale or setting. When the federal indictment was unsealed 2 weeks after the arrests, the documents revealed a scope of theft that shocked even me, and I'd been investigating this case for months. What I had initially identified as luxury vacation expenses disguised as board retreats was actually just the most obvious part of a criminal operation that had systematically looted over $480,000 from Meadowbrook Estates homeowners over 3 years. The court filing read like a catalog of entitled suburban excess, funded by stolen money. Karen had used HOA assessments to pay for a complete kitchen renovation in her house, billing it as community center upgrades that never happened. She'd charged a $28,000 swimming pool installation to emergency infrastructure repairs while the actual community pool sat unrepaired for 2 seasons. The audacity was breathtaking, but the documentation was irrefutable. But the most outrageous discovery was buried on page 12 of the indictment. Karen had purchased a 34-foot pleasure boat using funds from the emergency tree removal assessment, registering it under one of her shell companies, and claiming it as equipment for community maintenance purposes. Federal investigators had found photographs of Karen and her family enjoying weekend trips on their yacht, while homeowners struggled to pay the inflated assessments that funded her maritime lifestyle. The luxury vacation expenses I'd originally uncovered were just the beginning. Court documents revealed that Karen had charged family trips to Disney World, skiing vacations in Colorado, and a European cruise to various HOA budget categories, always with creative descriptions designed to make personal entertainment appear like legitimate community business. She'd even billed her daughter's college dormitory furniture to HOA accounts as office equipment purchases for board operations. Janet Morrison's involvement was more extensive than anyone had suspected. As treasurer, she hadn't just rubber-stamped Karen's expenditures. She'd actively participated in the money laundering scheme by creating fake invoices and maintaining duplicate accounting records designed to conceal the theft from annual financial reviews. Her supposedly naive cooperation was actually calculated criminal conspiracy that had enabled the systematic looting of community funds. The personal home improvements funded by stolen homeowner money were particularly galling. Karen had used emergency assessment funds to install a hot tub, upgrade her home security system, and landscape her backyard with expensive imported plants and professional hardscaping. Meanwhile, she was telling homeowners that the community faced a financial crisis requiring immediate emergency payments to prevent infrastructure collapse. The federal prosecutor's statement accompanying the indictment was devastating in its simplicity. The defendants treated their neighbors' homeowner association dues like a personal checking account, funding luxury lifestyles through systematic theft, while creating fake emergencies to extract additional money from victims who trusted their financial stewardship. Reading those court documents was like discovering that someone had been robbing your house for years while you paid them to provide security services. Karen Whitmore had turned community service into organized crime, and federal prosecutors were going to make sure she paid the maximum price for every dollar she'd stolen. The emergency community meeting held 3 weeks after the arrests was unlike any homeowners association gathering in Meadowbrook Estates history. The community center was packed with every single resident who could physically attend, plus several people standing along the walls because we'd run out of chairs. The atmosphere was part anger, part relief, and part desperate hope that we could somehow rebuild trust in an organization that had been systematically robbing us for years. Mr. Peterson, our retired attorney ally, had volunteered to facilitate the meeting since the entire elected board was either in federal custody or had resigned in disgrace. His opening remarks perfectly captured the community's mood. We're here tonight because 3 people we trusted to manage our money decided to steal it instead. Now we have to figure out how to move forward without repeating the mistakes that made their crimes possible. The first order of business was electing an entirely new board, but finding volunteers willing to take on the liability and responsibility was more challenging than anyone expected. Most residents had watched Karen's arrest on national television and weren't eager to inherit the legal complications of managing an organization under federal investigation. The community that had been too trusting before was now almost paralyzed by suspicion of anyone seeking leadership authority. That's when David Chen stood up and made the suggestion that would change my life. We need someone with the professional expertise to rebuild our financial systems and the proven integrity to ensure this never happens again. I nominate our forensic accountant neighbor for interim treasurer, with full authority to implement whatever oversight measures are necessary to protect community funds. I tried to decline, explaining that my investigative work had been motivated by self-interest in avoiding fraudulent assessments, not by any desire to serve in HOA leadership. But the room erupted in applause and demands that I accept the position, at least temporarily, to help establish proper financial controls and recover whatever stolen money could be retrieved through federal asset forfeiture proceedings. The reluctant acceptance speech I gave that night focused on the systematic changes needed to prevent future theft rather than any personal qualifications for community leadership. We implemented mandatory quarterly financial audits by independent accounting firms, required board approval for any expenditure over $500, and established a resident oversight committee with rotating membership to review all major financial decisions. Most importantly, we instituted complete transparency requirements that would make Karen's concealment tactics impossible. Every HOA financial record would be posted online monthly. Every contractor agreement would be available for resident review, and every board meeting would be recorded and archived for community access. The days of trusting elected officials to manage money without oversight were permanently over. Taking on the treasurer position meant inheriting the mess Karen had created, But it also gave me the authority to build financial systems that would protect our community from future predators who might see homeowners associations as easy targets for organized theft. The federal sentencing hearing 8 months later was everything I'd hoped it would be when I first discovered Karen's luxury vacation charges buried in our HOA credit card statements. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to our former treasurer, delivered the kind of justice that makes 15 years of investigating financial fraud feel worthwhile. Karen Whitmore was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and ordered to pay full restitution of $483,000 to the victims she'd systematically robbed. Standing in that federal courtroom and listening to Karen's sentencing was like watching the final scene of a perfectly scripted morality play. The woman who had once dismissed homeowner concerns with condescending lectures about trusting elected officials was now wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and begging for leniency from a federal judge who clearly had no sympathy for suburban criminals who prey on their neighbors' trust. Karen's defense attorney had tried to portray her as a well-meaning volunteer who made poor financial decisions under stress, but the prosecution's presentation of evidence made that argument laughable. Federal prosecutors methodically walked through each luxury purchase, each fake contractor payment, and each offshore account transfer, while Karen sat silently at the defendant's table, finally understanding that her criminal operation had been exposed down to the last stolen dollar. The judge's comments during sentencing perfectly captured the community impact of Karen's crimes. The defendant violated the trust of neighbors who believed she was working in their best interests while systematically stealing money they could barely afford to pay. This wasn't impulsive criminal behavior. It was calculated theft that demonstrated complete contempt for the people she was elected to serve. Janet Morrison received a lighter sentence of 4 years in federal prison after cooperating with prosecutors and providing testimony about Karen's money laundering operations. But her cooperation came too late to save her from financial ruin. The legal fees for her criminal defense had consumed her retirement savings, and the civil judgments from homeowner lawsuits would follow her for the rest of her life. Rick Stevens got the best deal of the co-conspirators, with 2 years in federal prison and 5 years probation, mainly because his lawyer convinced prosecutors that he'd been manipulated by Karen rather than actively participating in the criminal planning. But even his reduced sentence meant losing his job, his professional reputation, and most of his assets to restitution payments. The federal asset forfeiture process recovered over $200,000 in seized property, including Karen's boat, luxury vacation expenses charged to credit cards, and funds frozen in offshore accounts. Every homeowner in Meadowbrook Estates received partial refunds for the fraudulent assessments, though the complete financial recovery would take years to accomplish. Watching Karen led away in handcuffs after sentencing was the most satisfying moment of my professional career. The quiet guy up the hill had just watched a federal judge deliver justice that would protect every other community from Karen's brand of suburban terrorism. 6 months into my reluctant tenure as interim treasurer, I'd transformed the Meadowbrook Estates HOA from a criminal enterprise back into what it was always supposed to be, a transparent community organization that serves homeowners instead of robbing them. The process of building bulletproof financial systems was like performing surgery on a patient while keeping them alive, but the result was an organizational structure that would make future fraud virtually impossible. The new bylaws I drafted with Mr. Peterson's legal guidance eliminated every loophole that Karen had exploited during her criminal reign. No single board member could approve expenditures over $500 without documented approval from at least 2 other board members and advance notice to the community. All contractor agreements required competitive bidding with sealed proposals reviewed by an independent committee of rotating homeowner volunteers. Emergency assessments were limited to genuine emergencies, with third-party engineering verification and mandatory homeowner voting within 30 days. But the most important reform was implementing professional management oversight that removed financial temptation from volunteer board members. We hired Pinnacle Property Management, a firm specializing in HOA administration with bonded employees and comprehensive insurance coverage. Board members could no longer directly access community funds or approve vendor payments without professional review and documentation that created multiple layers of accountability. The financial transparency requirements I established would have made Karen's concealment tactics impossible. Every transaction over $50 now required photographed receipts, vendor verification, and detailed documentation posted to a community website within 72 hours. Monthly financial statements included bank account screenshots, credit card details, and comparison reports showing actual expenses against budgeted amounts. Any homeowner could request complete financial records at any time without going through board approval processes. My favorite reform was the quarterly independent audit requirement that made embezzlement practically impossible. Every 3 months, a certified public accounting firm reviews all HOA financial activity and produces a detailed report that gets mailed to every homeowner and posted publicly online. The audit costs were built into our annual budget, but they represented the best insurance policy our community could buy against future financial predators. The professional management company transformation was remarkable to witness. Pinnacle assigned us an experienced community manager who understood HOA law, maintained proper insurance coverage, and had no personal relationship with board members that could compromise financial oversight. Vendor selection became competitive and transparent, with documented bidding processes that eliminated the possibility of shell company fraud. Most importantly, the new systems created accountability that extended beyond individual board members to the management company, the independent auditors, and the rotating homeowner oversight committees. Karen's criminal operation had succeeded because she'd concentrated financial authority in her own hands while eliminating external oversight. The reformed HOA structure made it impossible for any individual to gain that kind of unchecked power over community resources. Building these systems was exhausting work, but knowing that no future Karen Whitmore could systematically rob our neighbors made every late night spent writing bylaws and reviewing audit procedures worth the effort. There's something deeply satisfying about being proven right when everyone initially thought you were just the paranoid neighbor who asked too many questions. A year after Karen's sentencing, I was sitting in my home office reviewing the quarterly financial audit that showed our HOA operating exactly as it should, transparently, efficiently, and without a single dollar being diverted to luxury vacations or personal boat purchases. The transformation from community outcast to reluctant hero had been gradual but undeniable. Karen used to dismiss my questions about financial documentation with condescending lectures about trusting elected officials and not micromanaging board decisions. She'd actually told other homeowners that I was the kind of resident who created unnecessary drama because I couldn't appreciate the complexities of community leadership. The irony was perfect. The woman who called me disruptive for asking basic accountability questions was simultaneously running the most elaborate HOA theft operation in state history. My vindication wasn't just personal. It was professional validation of everything I'd learned during 15 years of investigating corporate fraud. The pattern recognition skills that helped me expose healthcare billing schemes and construction contract fraud had worked exactly the same way on suburban HOA corruption. Criminal behavior follows predictable patterns, regardless of whether it happens in Fortune 500 boardrooms or neighborhood community centers. And the documentary evidence tells the same story once you know how to read it properly. The financial impact of stopping Karen's operation early was staggering when I calculated the numbers. Based on her escalating theft patterns and the offshore account structure federal investigators had discovered, she was positioning herself to extract over $2 million from Meadowbrook Estates over the following 5 years. The $42,000 emergency assessment that had triggered my investigation was just the beginning of a long-term criminal enterprise that would have bankrupted our community while funding Karen's increasingly extravagant lifestyle. More importantly, my case had become a template for homeowner protection that was being implemented in HOA communities across the region. The State HOA Regulatory Commission had adopted several of our transparency requirements as mandatory practices, and property management companies were using our oversight systems as best practice models for preventing embezzlement. The quiet guy who just wanted to avoid paying fraudulent assessments had accidentally created a statewide movement for HOA accountability. But the personal vindication that meant the most came from neighbors who had initially thought I was overreacting to routine board business. David Chen told me at the community barbecue last month that my persistence had saved his family from financial disaster since they'd been planning to take out a home equity loan to pay the $42,000 assessment. Maria Santos said watching Karen's arrest had taught her daughter that questioning authority figures isn't disrespectful, it's necessary for preventing corruption. The professional skills that made me seem antisocial and suspicious had ultimately protected an entire community from systematic theft. Being the forensic accountant who asks uncomfortable questions wasn't a character flaw. It was exactly the expertise our neighborhood needed to survive Karen Whitmore's criminal ambitions. 2 years after that first shocking $42,000 assessment notice arrived in my mailbox, I'm sitting at the same kitchen table where this entire investigation began, watching a moving truck pull up to Karen Whitmore's former house. The federal asset forfeiture process finally completed last month, and the property that had been purchased with stolen homeowner money was being sold to help fund restitution payments. Justice has a beautiful sense of timing. The new owners are a young couple with twin toddlers who have no idea they're moving into what was once the headquarters of the most sophisticated HOA fraud operation in state history. They'll never experience the fear of opening their mailbox to find fabricated emergency assessments, or worry about their community association president stealing their money to fund luxury vacations. The bulletproof financial systems we built ensure that Karen's brand of suburban terrorism can never happen again in Meadowbrook Estates. Standing up to bullies, especially ones who hide behind the authority of elected positions, requires more than just courage. It requires the professional expertise to build cases that can't be dismissed or intimidated away, and the persistence to see complex investigations through to their conclusion. Karen's biggest mistake was targeting someone whose day job involves exposing exactly the kind of financial fraud she was committing. She picked the wrong quiet guy to mess with. The broader lesson from this experience extends far beyond our neighborhood. Homeowners associations across America manage billions of dollars in community funds, often with minimal oversight and volunteer boards that lack professional financial training. Karen's operation succeeded for years because residents trusted elected officials without implementing proper accountability measures. Trust without verification isn't community spirit. It's an invitation for corruption. My forensic accounting investigation saved our community over $2 million in potential future theft, but more importantly, it demonstrated that individual expertise can make an enormous difference when applied to protect vulnerable populations. Corporate executives get most of the attention in financial fraud cases, but suburban criminals like Karen cause just as much damage to regular families who can't afford to lose their life savings to elaborate theft schemes. The satisfaction of watching Karen's foreclosure process unfold was matched only by the knowledge that hundreds of other HOA communities have implemented similar oversight systems based on our experience. The case that started with a suspicious assessment notice has become a national model for preventing homeowner association fraud, protecting families I'll never meet from criminals they'll never have to face. As the new homeowners unload their belongings and begin making Karen's former house into their family home, I'm struck by how normal everything looks. The neighborhood that survived systematic theft and federal criminal investigation has returned to being exactly what it was always supposed to be. A quiet suburban community where families can trust that their money is safe and their elected officials actually serve their interests. The quiet guy up the hill can finally go back to being invisible, knowing that Meadowbrook Estates is protected by systems that would make any future Karen Whitmore's criminal ambitions impossible to achieve.